Foxtrot, this is Delta. Hold your fire.
Those are the thoughts that go through my mind when I'm thinking about pre-attacking. And pre-attack is stage one. This stage actually focuses in on getting as much information or gathering as much information as possible about your target. Now, this can be done through things like scanning or things that we talked about back in ethical hacking, reconnaissance, and footprinting. One of the first things you're going to want to do is actually kind of set your boundaries. And what we mean by that is that you first need to come up with what we refer to as the rule of engagement. See, rules of engagement. You're thinking military squawk again, aren't you? But just like the military or even law enforcement, they have rules of engagement. For example, military personnel are not allowed to fire unless fired upon. Just because they see somebody with a weapon doesn't mean that they're able to go ahead and fire. Well, I guess it depends on the theater of war that they're in. Each one would have its own rules of engagement. And that's the same thing here. You're creating a formal permission to conduct the penetration test. And in the rules of engagement, you may specify whether or not you do technical or non-technical activities. And the rules of engagement explicitly defines these activities. A security professional that's doing a pen test might actually be allowed to do certain activities that normally would be considered illegal. Well, some of the rules of engagement items need to include things like the IP address range that you're going to test or that you're allowed to test, and you do not go outside of that range. Also, times that the test would be conducted during business hours, after business hours. Now you may be thinking, well, the pen test should take place anytime, but that really does depend because again, if you're doing a simulation of a gray box attack from the inside, that might be done strictly during business hours. You also need to have a list of hosts that the client, again, or department may deem restricted. And again, I don't care if you see it, if it's on that list, you don't touch it. You'll also want to list the acceptable testing techniques. Do you allow social engineering, a denial of service attack? What tools will you be using? Password crackers, network sniffers, Nmap. Will it be an aggressive Nmap scan or a stealthy Nmap scan? You should also obviously specify the length of the test. Now, depending on the test itself or what you've agreed to, some pen tests can take up to 2 to 3 months to accomplish. Also, anybody that's on the penetration team should have a point of contact or contacts in case there's an emergency of some sort. You also need to list some measures to prevent law enforcement from being called with false alarms that may be created by the test, especially if it's a physical test. Your rules of engagement should also include how to handle information that you've gathered. Now, one of my prerequisites is that when I do a pen test for a company, they provide me with a laptop. It's not a laptop that I get to keep. It's a laptop that I use during the pen test, including the reporting. And after I'm done with the pen test, I turn that laptop into them with instructions that they need to store that laptop away for possible future pen tests as a follow-up. But that way there, I'm not accused of storing their information on my personal systems. Now, technology does change rapidly, so if they put the laptop away for 5 or 6 years, that laptop could actually be obsolete. So I've also heard of people just pulling the hard drives out of the laptop and storing those. You'll want to make sure that those are stored in an extremely secure location. Now, another thing you need to understand when going through the pre-attack stage is it's not necessarily what you want to do, it's what the customer requires. So yeah, you're going to have a list that the customer provides, or it may be information that you gathered during the interview process so that you can make sure that you address them completely. So you'll want to review with the customer or the department what needs to be tested. Servers, workstations, routers, firewalls, network devices, databases, applications, physical security, telecommunications, VoIP systems. You'll also want to create a checklist of requirements, meaning the customer requires us to definitely do these particular tests. You'll also want to go through and specify the sectors to be tested and organize the users, meaning I might have only certain departments that they want me to take a look at, maybe just the accounting department or maybe just the sales department. And you're going to want to notify the folks in those departments that something could be happening within the next, between now and December. You'll also, again, want to identify your time frames, which we talked about in the previous slide. But again, we want to make sure that it's the time frame that the customer requires. Again, it's not what you think is best, unless of course they're asking you for advice. You also need to make sure that you develop an emergency plan. that we come across a situation where a real malicious attacker has made their way in. What do we do in those situations? We'll also want to make sure that all the information is securely backed up before beginning to do anything, because some of the things that you might do could actually make modifications to the original files when you think about planting a Trojan inside of a file. And of course, you'll also want to decide on the format that you're going to use for your reporting. Is it done in a standard Word document? Do they want it in PDF? What information do they want to see displayed depending on who's looking at the report? For example, maybe the manager of the sales department doesn't need to see all the details of what happened. He just needs to see the things that he needs to take care of. And of course, who's involved in delivering the report? Now, we have to be very careful here because many times we're attacking the work of an IT professional. And presenting the report in a way that it's constructive instead of ridiculing is truly an art form. So the security professional that delivers this report needs to be aware that there could be some animosity that comes up. And on a side note, I always like to reference the fact that you report everything. It doesn't even matter if it may be painful. And what I mean by that is I once did a pen test for a company where the gentleman who hired us to come in to do the pen testing, we actually ended up finding information on his hard drive that wasn't of an adult nature. And the company had a strict zero tolerance policy, and it resulted in this guy getting fired. Tell me if that wasn't a tough one to do. So in order to keep track of all this, the one thing you're going to do is, start making lists. And believe me, there's a lot of them. Here's some things that you may want to include on your checklist. Things like the network layout. Where are the subnets? What ranges are they using? Look at the physical security, both of servers and networking devices, but also the building itself. Can somebody walk into the office and find an empty jack? And don't forget, not just with the network layout, make sure you understand both external as well as the internal IP addresses. Look at the network devices, routers and switches. How many do they have? Speaking of how many they have, how many devices actually exist? That includes host machines. I would also include in that printers, anything that's hooked to the network. Do they want a map of their internet presence? Show them what's accessible from the outside. And if these devices are connected to both external and internal, you'll need the addresses of both sides of the NICs. What about what OS is on the network? We know how to do that with a Nmap scan, right? Or doing some type of fingerprinting or even a banner grab. How about this one? What about the servers? If you're doing a pen test and they have 5 or less servers of, for example, Windows, Linux, Unix, do you want to review more servers? And if so, how many of each type? We've talked about making sure that are there any systems that are off limits? Make sure you can identify those. Does the customer require an assessment of wireless networks or their analog systems as well as their mobile devices, especially if the organization deploys a mobile workforce? What about the web apps and services that are offered by the client? And if that client has a front-facing website, do they actually have click-throughs to visit other sites or possibly pulling in content from other sources into their site? Some of the biggest malware and ransomware attacks currently are caused by the ad networks. These are networks that provide advertisements that Microsoft or Yahoo, these are ad networks that legitimate sites can not have to worry about creating themselves. They just subscribe to them. And lo and behold, a malicious attacker creates an ad, and it's just HTML, maybe a little JavaScript, that he then purchases space inside of the ad network. And these ad networks are used by hundreds of websites, and they have no idea that they could be offering up malicious code when you go to visit their website. Hey, yep, you get infected. You'll also need to make sure that you go through and define the scope of the pen test. That's going to include things like the deliverables, meaning what are the list of reports that are going to be made available after you've completed the test. Also, the data definitions, meaning the form that the results of the test will take. You'll need to also define the functionality, a verification of whether the system works as expected, and the technical structure, which should include flow diagrams to show the processes and steps that you went through. Now, there's one thing you need to be concerned about, and it's something you need to explain to the client, and that is if the pen test takes a while to do, during that time frame, changes actually may be incorporated into their network without the pen tester's knowledge. And usually the client doesn't understand the impact of those changes. Before any changes are made during the pen test time frame, should be reviewed or sent to the engagement lead from the pen testing company so he could explain the effects of the changes that they're about to make. Some of these changes would include any business process changes, any technical changes. If the company moves, a location change would be a pretty big one for us, as well as any applications that are changed. Now, I'm not talking about updates to applications. I'm talking more switching out to completely different applications. Now, when considering the scope of the pen test, the testing team should actually be looking at things like the system software security, meaning security and configuration. They should be looking at software and system-based vulnerabilities. Obviously, we need to be looking at the network security, meaning that we look at all the different network components and their configuration. Are there any defaults that are still in play? We'll also want to take a look at the client-side application security. The testing team should check the client-side application for security and compliance, as well as the client-side to server-side security. Meaning as the data transmits from the client to the server, how's that secured down? And also, since we've done the client and the client to server, we then also need to obviously look at just the server side security. So we'll be looking at both web applications running as well as just straight up apps running for flaws. In the scope, will we implement social engineering techniques to try to see if we can't gather some passwords or project details? The scope should also include things like document security. How do employees destroy documents that aren't used anymore? One of the things that you should definitely emphasize is the use of shredding machines. Please, if anything, after this course, go buy yourself your own personal one. We'll also want to assess the application communication security for any unauthorized interceptions. Within the scope, we'll look at physical security because technically the organization should restrict physical access to only departments that are relevant to the use of those systems. You've heard me talk about dumpster diving before. How is the trash secured? A lot of companies hire in shredding companies to come in and dispose of their documents. But believe it or not, information still gets out through the regular trash. So that we need to make sure that they understand that this is one of the vectors that can be used. You should also be checking for disgruntled employees who might want to release confidential data or take it with them to a competitor. One of the other cool things that you may want to review with the client is sabotaging intruder confusion. Many times companies will implement strategies such as a honeypot to confuse or even mislead intruders. They end up spending their time thinking that particular honeypot is genuine. So as a pen tester, you need to make sure that you test those if they have those in place. You also need to test within the scope the response. What is the appropriate response for each type of incident? Next up, we have the contracts. So we've made our list. We now need to make sure that we get some John Hancocks on some documents. Some of those documents are going to include our non-disclosure agreement. This is to make sure that we safeguard the company's information. We should also be very clear about the fees and the schedules, especially if the project goes beyond the projected schedule because of something that was not foreseen. You'll also want to have a sensitive information document. It would include information that's related to the company's electronic assets, applications that are currently under development, anything that would be of sensitive nature that is required by the pen testing team. You should also include a confidential information contract. This is going to be where you include things like trade secret information, again, network information, telephone system information, customer data, business materials. Typically, this type of information is provided to the pen tester. And this is another reason why I mentioned earlier that I recommend the company providing you a laptop that is their property. So they don't have to worry about you taking off with some of their confidential info. But the contract should also mention the fact that you won't divulge or give copies to any third person or competitor. This helps to set a trust level between you and the company because think about it, you're about to attack them and look to see if you can steal information. Then we have the indemnification clause. This actually protects the pen tester from any legal or financial liabilities. This is in case, and it does happen sometimes, that the pen test actually results in some type of loss or damage to assets of the company. We also refer to this as cover your donkey. You should also have in your contracts a reporting and responsibility section. This should be a guideline that actually states the methodology for performing the test, and then how you will report those procedures and how you will report those back. The next item in your pre-attack phase is actually information gathering. This could be done a couple of different ways. We can either use our passive reconnaissance, looking at public records, doing a little Google hacking or Googling on the company, anything that's not aggressive. And of course, the aggressive side would be doing active reconnaissance. And if you're not familiar with the in-depth steps of reconnaissance, I again recommend you go back and take a look at our ethical hacking, reconnaissance, and footprinting course. We'll also want to do something called web profiling, meaning can we get a directory structure of the web servers or FTP servers, catalog all the web-based forms, types of user input that's allowed, form submission destinations, catalog also error messages that pop up, because that can help to identify a system, third-party links, and applications. You can see the list is long, and we spend a lot of time in this particular stage. And that's because it actually is what helps to cover yourself and cover the client. So there's a expectation level that is created and met. Now, is it me or is the guy in the middle lock picking his ear? Nah, he's talking on a cell phone, isn't he? Another ADD moment brought to you by my consumption of aspartame.